Welcome to the Daily Plunge. We're in the book of Acts, chapter 13, verses 13 through 25. Paul and Silas are on the move. They're traveling up into what would be modern-day Turkey. They drop off John Mark at Perga to go back to Jerusalem, and then they head inland. And they end up at a place called Pisidian Antioch, and on the Sabbath day, they go to the synagogue. And remember, Paul is a respected rabbi. And so they asked these men from Jerusalem, Barnabas and Saul, if they'd like to speak on the scriptures. And Paul won't miss the opportunity. And he begins to lay out salvation history. And he speaks to both folks who are Israelites, who are Jews, and those who are God seekers, Gentiles, who are seeking the one God, who are there worshiping God at the synagogue. And he says, God chose our ancestors Israel, and he made them prosper in Egypt, and then with mighty power he brought them out through Moses. And after 40 years, he, teaching them how to be the people of Israel, brought them into the promised land, drove out the nations before them in Canaan so that they could possess the land. He said all this took 450 years. And then came the judges up until Samuel. With Samuel, they selected Saul to be the king. He didn't work out, so they replaced him with David. And God said, I have found this man after my own heart, and out of his lineage I will bring forth my Messiah. And then he says, before the coming of Jesus, John came preaching that he was just, the predecessor for the Messiah. Now, what is the purpose of this? Paul is telling them that the way to read Scripture is through the lens of Jesus, through the lens of Jesus' cross and resurrection, and his purpose to glorify the Father. And that's the way that we're called to interpret the Old Testament. Luther said this very explicitly, that again, the lens by which we understand all of the Old Testament is through the lens of the Messiah, Jesus Christ. But how often do we not interpret the rest of Scripture through the lens of Jesus? And I would challenge you that as you read Scripture, constantly be asking yourself, how does Jesus interpret this passage? What does this passage mean in terms of Jesus' death and resurrection and his glory? And, we're constantly reading Scripture in terms of that God calls us into a relationship with him, and that as we are called into that relationship, then we respond. So it's constantly this mix between the covenant, by which we are made God's people, and God's kingdom, by which we exercise kingdom authority in our lives, first and foremost, that our lives would be changed, and then to bring that grace into the world. And so every time you're reading Scripture, ask yourself, how does the work of Jesus' cross and resurrection interpret every single line of Scripture? Well, thank you, my friends. Have a blessed day.